So today I'd like to just start by telling you a little bit about our class and our quest for the lost apples of Texas. The class is called In Search of Texas Beauty because Texas Beauty is one of the 67 cultivars that are unique to Texas that were developed here during kind of the golden age of apple propagation in the United States, which we can trace through the 19th century until it crashed suddenly in the 1920s and 30s. But I'll give you a little bit of the backstory for this class. I'll show you a couple of clips to help kind of give you some context for where we are and how this got started. But I think it's very appropriate to the Sowell collection in literature, community, and the natural world, because in looking at the natural and human history of apples and looking at the literature of apples, all of these things come together. The apple Texas, the name rather, In Search of Texas Beauty, comes from the apple called Texas Beauty, which is one of the lost apples of Texas that we haven't seen for quite a while. Most of these started to kind of taper off in the 19-teens and 20s into the 30s. There are complicated reasons for that. You'll hear a little bit more about that in the clip I'm going to show you in a moment. But I'll start at the beginning. Before I came to teach at Texas Tech, I was director of the Southern Historical Collection at the University of North Carolina. And it was an incredible, endless summer kind of job. I got to meet fascinating people and hear their stories, encourage them to put their materials in archives. And one of the people I met was this very unassuming elderly gentleman named Lee Calhoun. Lee was, his career was actually in the Army. He was in Southeast Asia. He built his home in a quasi-commune in North Carolina in the 1970s, and incredibly, he kind of did this on the side. He looked up plans that he liked. You'll actually, I think, maybe see a little bit of his home in this video. He looked at the plans, he cleared the land, he built his own house, and he got interested along the way in apple trees. And not just any apple trees, but local apple trees. He started to collect the stories. It began with his efforts to establish a little orchard at his house, and then he began to collect the stories behind the apples. And he realized that there were stories of enslaved people, Native Americans, of course, lots of colonials who had created their own apple varieties. And he also realized that these things were becoming vanishingly scarce. With apples, the only way to propagate is by graft. As we've learned in our research and many discussions, basically what you see in the wild, apples from seedlings, they're all by nature hybrids. They came from, pollinated trees, and so you don't know what you're going to get. Johnny Appleseed, as part of his great colonial project, scattered apple seeds promiscuously everywhere he went. And these provided everything from fodder for horses to cider for the colonials who were spreading out across the continent. So in that sense, apples really went hand in hand with colonization. But if you want to find the old ones, you have to find living trees. And that is where our journey began as a class. I'm really proud of our first year cohort for taking on an incredibly difficult and daunting research project. And I'm looking forward to introducing them and giving them a chance to talk a little bit about their research, and we'll open it up to question and answers at the end. So that's just a bit of context about where we started out. And I'll just add that part of it, as I see it, research methodology and doing research should be a creative enterprise. And I'm glad that Andy Wilkinson is here, because this is what he has been teaching, preaching, and helping people experience themselves in his own work. I think there's an assumption that when you do research, there's a sort of established methodology. But I think we have to throw that out the window when we try to retrieve the past sometimes. And where we began as a class is, look, we're going to figure this out together. There have already been creative insights and discoveries that have come out of the class, in part because we just keep asking, well, how do we get there? Tell us more. And I think we've all come already to appreciate how we have to have human connections in some cases to retrieve a piece of natural history. So let me show you a few clips and share a few things that we've done so far, and then we'll hear from the class and about some of the connections to the Sowell collection and research that they've done, and then we'll open it up for discussion.
In the foothills of North Carolina's Blue Ridge Mountains, Lee Calhoun is resurrecting a piece of American history.
150 years ago, there were 6,000 apple varieties that were widely grown, and now that's dwindled down to a few hundred.
From 6,000 to just a few hundred.
Yes.
Calhoun is pruning back the hands of time in an effort to save old Southern apples. Apples are as American as, well, you know. Brought over by some of the first European settlers, apples were a critical part of the early American diet. They were hearty, nutritious, delicious, and versatile.
They were fried for breakfast. They were stewed for supper. They were dried on the rooftop to have apples in the wintertime.
The apple took root, particularly in southern states, sprouting countless varieties with distinctive names like Arkansas Black, Gilmore Winesap, Swiss Limbertwig, and Paragon, to name a few. But as time went on, something happened, and these heirloom varieties started to disappear.
Well, you blame it on the railroads. Apples could be shipped by railroad from distant places. They didn't even grow apples anymore.
Over 30 years ago, Calhoun decided to bring back lost apples.
We had more apples this year than I've ever seen in this orchard.
He saved more than 500 varieties, some of which are the only ones known to exist. But saving these apples isn't just about history.
We have apples that taste like pineapples, some that taste like coconut,
Come on!
some taste like raspberries, so we need to try. Very fine.
And also great flavor. 60 miles north in Douglasburg, Virginia, Diane Flint of Foggy Ridge Cider shares Lee Calhoun's passion for apples. Flint uses primarily native Virginia apples to make her award-winning ciders. And she says there's a reason why.
These uncommon or heritage apples that we grow for cider have very complex flavors and just a richness and depth that is essential for making good hard cider.
She sees her cider as just the latest expression of an American tradition.
Cider has been made and consumed in this country since our country's founding. And I like to think that we are reinventing tradition.
And interest in the old-time beverage is bubbling up. with restaurants across the country quenching thirsts with hard cider. Still, to Lee Calhoun, it all comes back to the apple of his eye.
To find an apple that I thought was extinct, to find it and then to grow it and taste it for the first time. Boy, right here. Get you.
So Kazakhstan being the place where apples originated. Lee has some absolutely amazing stories about how he found the apples too. And in some cases, he and his wife, they get a letter. This is where his archival material came from. They get a letter or a photograph. Someone in West Virginia has an apple, they can document it, they'd hop in the car, and they would go. And he told me a story of a field. He got to one of these sites, and the field, as it turned out, had been burned over. And there was an old tree in it, the kind that's completely hollow in the core. That had been scoured out by fire. It was blackened. And somehow there was one little shoot still growing on that tree. So he clipped it, he brought it home, and he brought it back. And he had other varieties that came back from England because they had been taken abroad in various ways, and he was able to authenticate them. And so now there's a heritage farm where he has hundreds of these varieties growing in North Carolina. We had a chance to speak with Lee recently via Skype, and it's very powerful because Lee has pancreatic cancer, which was what his wife died of years ago. He's been doing this for decades, and the book that I passed around is the work that he did with his wife to painstakingly document each of these and disentangle them in different ways. But I want to show you a little clip of our interaction with Lee.
Not impossible, but really, really slim.
He's talking about how hard it is
That
to
doesn't
find.
mean we shouldn't look for them. It doesn't mean we shouldn't ask our grandparents if they know anybody or that type of thing, but you have to be realistic about the chances of being successful, and it's pretty low. It was low for me 4 years ago. It was really low now. So, I think if you go or if you patronize farmers markets and get to know the people who are selling fruits and vegetables there, why not ask them to grow some of these heirloom apples, for farmers market outlets? It might be something they can make some money off of, and it might be something that you and your friends could get a chance to eat highly flavorful apples again after a long time not been able to do that.
So, Lee has given us all kinds of advice about how to find these apples, and he was thrilled to hear about what we were doing. He said, I never got to Texas, and it's a big state. We're actually in the best part of Texas for apples because of chilling days, but obviously for heirloom apples to hold on, they have to be irrigated. So we're more likely to find them in East Texas. I'll show you a couple more, and I want to share just a few more things with you, and then let's hear from folks about research. So one of the things that we have done, we started with the list of purportedly extinct Texas apples in that book I passed around, Old Southern Apples. They have these beautiful names, and you will see that there are a lot of them. There's the Seek No Further, the Mrs. Richardson. And obviously those apples give us great clues. Sometimes we can search for them by the creator's name. And notice number 55, Texas Beauty, which is where the name of the course came from. And so we created a list of all these and what description we had. And then we started to populate a master spreadsheet with all of the qualities of these apples, where they were grown. And we can go after them in different ways based on the clues that we have. We also made, we spent a lot of time in this wonderful resource, the Biodiversity Heritage Library, which is from a consortium of institutions. And they have thousands of old nursery catalogs. And so we can look at where these apples were in Texas and think about ranging out geographically. I can't wait until, hopefully we're actually going to do at least one trip to go search some of these out based on the ones that are most promising. But we've already had an early and kind of happy discovery thanks to the research that we've been doing. And Heather had been on the trail of some apples, including a variety called the Pride of Texas. And we had talked about it. She was looking at old property maps and nurseries and where these might be in Texas. And that was how, when we found this article here about 5 varieties that had been found in Washington State, we were able to connect the dots. This man, David Benscoter, is a retired federal investigator. And this goes back to last spring. He found 5 more of these. David mainly works from property records and people's names. That's his methodology. So what did we do? We called him up one day and talked to him as a class, but here we were able to make an important connection. They mentioned the rediscovery of the McAfee apple, and the McAfee goes by another name. It's called the Pride of Texas as well, so it is one of the 67 missing varieties. So now we have a chance to actually bring it back and establish it here. One of the things we talked about doing is, how do we do this on campus? We're looking at getting cuttings later in the semester, maybe early next year, but it's on our list. This is totally redundant to bring the Pride of Texas back to Texas, right? So I think that's it for my show and tell, and let's get into the presentations. I think maybe 2 presenters have a PowerPoint that they wanted to share, so y'all can set that up. And in the meantime, let's hear from our first presenter about ties between community and food and the Sowell connection. Who's on deck? Who wants to step up? Are you ready? All right. So this is Catherine Rodriguez, and Rosales, excuse me. And I'll let her jump right in, and maybe y'all can get set up while she's presenting.
What is your favorite childhood meal? For me, it was a Filipino dish called sinigang, which is a very sour and savory soup. When I think about why it's my favorite meal, I realize that the connection I felt towards it extended far beyond its taste. I loved the dish for how it brought my family together in its preparation, and for the many memories I have associated with it. This brings me to the question of, what place does food have in our sense of identity? In our society, food has many components, from the planting and harvesting of crops, the sale of ingredients as commodities, and the fusion of different cuisines. The vast majority of food that most people encounter is a product of our current agricultural system that operates using very unsustainable practices, such as overexploitation, chemical contamination, and habitat destruction, all of which has resulted in the loss of biodiversity as well as the loss of deep cultural traditions that once linked large communities. This relationship illuminates the indispensability of food and the personal connection to the land in which it comes from. Food serves as a source and origin of communal and personal identity. Ultimately, biodiversity is necessary for both the physical and cultural survival of a community. In the 4th issue of The Snail from the winter of 2006, Gary Paul Nabhan wrote Seafood Traditions at Risk in North America, where he analyzes the negative ecological and cultural effects of the loss of biodiversity. He claims that part of America's cultural heritage was built on waters where artisans practiced their traditions of weaving nets and basket traps, where chefs made unforgettable meals of oyster and crab jambalayas, alder smoked salmon, clam chowder, blackened redfish, and salted bacalao. Overall, Nabhan makes it apparent that fishing is far more complex than it seems at first glance, due to deep-settled roots in cultural traditions. By using specific examples of different fishing equipment and mentioning regional dishes, he emphasizes the inseparable human quality of food, that there's something about food that's very personal and intimate. Offhandedly, Nabhan is gently poking at the surface of human ethics to remind us that there is more to food than its mere existence on our plate. The food that finds its way in front of us has a history far beyond our conception. It has ties to traditional methods of hunting and gathering, old family recipes, indigenous groups, and cultural practices, all of which have their own story and identity to tell. Within the food we eat lies a heritage that we are connected to in ways that we will never completely know. So we need to ask ourselves, in what ways can society choose to see food within its grander context instead of its minute existence on our plates? Part of the answer lies in gathering knowledge and putting it through action through individual and collective efforts. But some may argue that the conservation of biodiversity is this self-serving act that we do in order to rid ourselves of this guilt we feel for destroying the earth. But while this may in part have some truth, it's an argument that diminishes the issue of how we as humans are co-inhabitants of the earth, and thus have a moral obligation to protect it. In the same way that Earth sustains us, we have a responsibility to ensure its survival. We must alter our current lifestyle to promote a more sustainable coexistence with nature. Nabhan's article attempts to bridge this lapse between scientific endeavors and the humanities by implying that there's an emotional tie to food that people naturally develop over time. So how does our life fit into this interconnected web of ecological survival? This remains a current challenge that every individual must answer for themselves. In the meantime, I urge you to ask yourself this question: how has your identity been shaped through food? Thank you.
So now we'll hear from Sophie LaPointe and Taylor Musgrove.
Yes.
Who were kind of going down a similar trail based on what they found in the collection. Are you okay? Do you need anything to change slides? I think you just use the arrow key. Yeah, there you go. Yep.
Okay, no human on earth is the same as one another. Whether it be because of the color of their hair, their religion, their taste in food, or their favorite season, all people are different in one way or another. Communities alike are different everywhere around the world. This poses the question, what makes one community different from the next? The simple answer is food.
I discovered a useful source from the Sowell collection that is simple but very impactful when responding to the topic of connections between food and community. This source was a poem by the Tutelo people called The Bean Woman and focused on the story of a woman who cried out to find a man for marriage. I found this poem interesting because it utilizes food and crops to help the audience understand the complexities of human connection. To summarize, the animal people and the plant people lived together in a village beside the river. One morning, a woman was heard singing along the river in the search for a husband. The woman had a very beautiful voice, attracting many suitors, being from both the animal and plant groups. However, she turned most of them away because the food they offered her was not the type of food she desired. She repeated throughout the poem, "Then if I married you, I would die, for I never eat that kind of food," showing that the bean woman knew exactly what she desired in a suitor and she refused to settle for less. The woman ended up marrying a man who offered her corn and nothing else, for she knew that he would be her husband as soon as she heard of this. She said, "This is how it was meant to be. The great Creator made us to always be with each other." This is because she realized that his corn complemented her beans better than any other crop or animal could. This left behind the story of the bean woman and the idea of how two partners should complement one another, and nobody should settle for a partner who does not bring out their best features. Specifically relating this idea to food, the poem emphasizes that every gardener needs to work together with others, and this can happen only if we listen well to each other. While the poem may be fictional, it grasps the concept of community and two partners coming together as one to complement and assist one another in their own personal growth.
It may seem ridiculous to link food to the individuality of an entire group of people, but the story behind the connection of food and community goes deeper than one might think. Flagstaff, a small town in Arizona, is the perfect example of food creating a unique and positive identity for a group of citizens. In an article from the Center for Sustainable Environments, the economic and ecological benefits of their very own farmers market are dissected. From the opening of Flagstaff Community Farmers Market in July of 2001 to May of 2003, there has been a tenfold growth in the purchase of fresh, locally produced foods eaten in Flagstaff and surrounding communities. The strengths that the farmers market has brought to Flagstaff has changed the way their community flows, as well as continuing to grow a deeper connection between the people of Flagstaff and their local farmers, land, and neighbors. A farmers market may not seem like much to people from towns that have a supermarket on every street corner, and they may wonder, why don't they just go to the store to pick this stuff up? But there are many unknown benefits from buying locally, not only for yourself, but the farmers too. The people of Flagstaff, Arizona reported that local farmers were receiving a 600% increase in the return from the farmers market instead of the return they would receive from selling to local grocery stores and distributors. This helps the farmers support their families and be able to continue to grow their food so that they can produce more for the next farmers market.
The idea of one gardener needing to work with other gardeners in the community in order to be successful growing and selling crops also suggests that food production requires interpersonal relationships and encourages community and unity within the farming group. This unity is based solely on the reliance for assistance and community support in successfully growing and cultivating crops, while emphasizing that the success of one is dependent on the success of all. This shows that food is a part of the human culture in more ways than one and is useful in bringing people together as well as nourishing our bodies and fueling our creativity with new recipes and challenges.
In parallel to the farmers' welfare, the consumers who purchase the food from the local farmers market will benefit from eating locally grown crops. It is a well-known fact that foods that we buy in grocery stores are packaged and then shipped again before they are even ripe enough to pick, let alone eat. Locally grown foods are known to have more nutrients because they are allowed to grow until ripe enough to pick and then directly brought to the people of the surrounding towns. Besides health benefits, consumers will also benefit from the circulation of money in the area. If a good is purchased at the local farmers market, the money stays where it started rather than being circulated through large corporations. This gives the economy of the town a boost and gives reassurance to the people of cities like Flagstaff that there will always be a flow of money in town. Lastly, it is important for a community to be good to its environment. Flagstaff, Arizona is a prime example of making an intelligent, positive change to their old ways of distributing in order to stop harming the environment. One may wonder how a farmer's market would help the environment, but before the Flagstaff Community Farmers Market began, most organic food in town was transported from California and most conventional food from a major regional redistribution center in Los Angeles, with much of its produce actually being from the San Joaquin Valley. In the graphic on the next slide, you can see that the amount of fossil fuels wasted on the transportation of food is 1,000 times more than the amount used for transportation to a local farmer's market. When a community has a personal connection to its food, it is stronger, more interconnected, healthier, and environmentally friendly. A community with these characteristics is bound to be a good one, and it can be all traced back to the dinner table. The connection between a community and its food is usually an overlooked one, but an important one. There's an inevitable connection between humans and the food they eat. It is what makes every place you visit unique. Flagstaff is unlike any other community, but it does not mean that others cannot follow in their footsteps.
So, how did this whole topic relate to our class? Well, our job is to search for and hopefully be successful in finding the lost heirloom apple varieties of Texas. That being said, our class is just another perfect example of food bringing people together in the community, and we have gotten the opportunity to experience that firsthand. Without this class, many of us may have never met and developed such an interest for the effects of food on our daily lives, and we believe it is important for everybody to come to that realization. Our human lives revolve around food in a nutritional sense, but food is also useful in so many other ways. Thank you.
Finally, we'll hear from Matthew Sowell.
How many of you have cut a potato with a knife? Raise your hand. How many of you have cut a potato with a knife? Well, to the Quechua Native Americans of South America, you might be considered a murderer. Because to them, potatoes are actually members of their family, living members of their family. They value potatoes so much, they actually assign guardians to these potatoes. It is incredibly important to Quechuan culture and food culture. Now, to us Americans, this might sound, some may call it primitive or strange, but have we forgotten something important about food culture by calling it primitive? Have we just brushed past something really important? In one of Gary Nubbin's works, one of his unfinished notebooks, he discusses how important the Quechuan potato is to them. Two of six villages in the high Andes, of South America actually had a territorial dispute, and they saw bloodshed over this territorial dispute until the Parque de Papa initiative ended the dispute, but slowly became a biodiversity project. What was this initiative? This initiative sought to resolve the conflict through food culture. And the way they did this was by removing some of the government-provided potato variety seeds and replacing them with local varieties that the Quechuans had hundreds of years ago. And they encouraged the return of old Quechuan food traditions regarding these potatoes. And by doing this, all of these Quechuan communities united, and they ended their bloodshed. Now, American food culture was actually once like this. We had the apple, and we had Thanksgiving. We still have Thanksgiving today, but it once was a much more important religious tradition. It was expressing gratitude, particularly towards a great harvest and towards a great year, and there were religious aspects to it. Today, it's just a family gathering. It's lost much of its importance. And the apple is just another food in the supermarket. The apple meant so much to settlers in the United States hundreds of years ago that every settler, or most settlers, were encouraged to plant an apple tree in their new land so that they could sustain themselves through the winter. Apples were delicious. They were they adapted well to new climates, and they could be stored over the winter. Today, the American food culture unfortunately focuses on snacks. Quick, somewhat tasty, simple, and disposable. That's what it means to us. It's just disposable. What if we regained some of the insight that Quechuan food culture holds for us? What if bloodshed and territorial disputes can be solved by simply focusing on a food like a potato, then couldn't some of the problems in American society be solved by something like the apple or the potato? Ideology, politics, and philosophies are these complex things that don't really unite people. Perhaps all we need is something simple, like food culture and the potato. As Americans, perhaps all we need to do is return to our old sibling, the apple, to resolve some of the social divisions that have grown in the modern age. Thank you.
So the common denominator in the presentations, we heard about connections that were discovered through the Sowell collection. And I want to commend our students on their courage. I never gave a presentation to a large group a month after arriving in college, so I want to thank them and compliment them on the courage that it takes to present in an environment like this. And I feel like we're just getting started. I mean, this is one of the challenges of our class. You know, we're making discoveries. The semester is going to run out on us really quickly. But I hope to keep this project moving forward in different ways, and I hope that we'll all stay involved in it in different ways. In any case, let's open it up to questions and discussion. I'd like to invite everyone in the class, obviously, to participate. It doesn't just need to be presenters or me. Let's get a conversation going here. Yes, John?
You mentioned the phrase chilling days. I don't know what that is.
Chilling days are the number of days where apples are happy because of colder temps, basically. And so at 3,000 feet, our environment is a little more like the hills of Kazakhstan, the higher elevations that they like. It's also why the McAfee popped up in Washington State, which is sort of the perfect natural nursery for apples. There are lots of chilling days there naturally, plenty of moisture, all the rest of it. Yeah. Stephen, you had something, yeah. Yeah. We have been tasting some of them, and actually just the other day, Briley brought back from New Mexico some mystery apples. Would you like to, you should say more about that, Briley. Yeah. Yeah, come on up if you want. That way people will be able to hear you.
So as Dr. Ginsma said, I'm from New Mexico, Aztec, New Mexico, and it's the northern part. Like, I live 2 miles from the Colorado state line. And so we're pretty high elevation, and we do have a lot more chilling days. And I live on about 10 acres, and we have a bunch of fruit and nut trees on my property. And so after I took this class, I kind of grew a bigger interest in all of the fruit on my property. And so I went home last weekend and decided to bring back some apples for our class. And we have some pretty old trees on my property, and we have no idea what they are. So we brought some back, and hopefully we can trace back what they are. So, yeah, pretty much.
So we've sampled a number of varieties already. Unfortunately, the big orchard outside of town in Idalou is closed this year. They've pulled a bunch of trees, they've replanted, they're getting, I think, an organic cert and planting grapes. But we've already gotten a lot into the flavor, we're really getting into the flavor profiles of them. And what you learn, you know, when you start looking at this is that these things had these really specialized niches, and there are wonderful stories. It reminded me, Briley was talking about some of the hay on her property. I talked to people in the Appalachian Mountains who described how they would store apples deep inside hay bales. And I don't know if this was done in West Texas, but imagine that as, you know, someone had an early memory of being a child, and it's the kind of thing, you have the kid by the ankles, get in there and get the apples out, and you could smell them before you ever touched them in the hay bale. But I was surprised to learn as we looked into this that some apple varieties are notable because they have no odor. And we've come to really appreciate some of the finer points of, the different varieties. What would be great, and maybe there are folks who want to speak more to this, is if we could get something going with a farmer's market here. It can be very profitable. When we get the pride of Texas back here, that could be a great opportunity for a local grower, and for that matter, to sell to local restaurants. Other questions, and feel free to direct them straight to the class if you have a question for students or whatever. Yes, sir.
This is not exactly a question, but I've been thinking, you said that apples originated about 4,500 years ago in Kazakhstan, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
What does a person who takes the Bible literally think about what the forbidden fruit was? Wasn't it supposed to have been an apple? And wasn't it supposed to have been 6,000 years ago, according to people who believe the Bible literally? Then maybe you're wrong, or maybe no. I won't say the other possibility.
Well, I can pull it up for you. There's an interesting piece based on a story that NPR ran years ago. But in fact, there's not good evidence that the forbidden fruit was an apple, and the translation of this is both variable and blurry. So what I find interesting about that, though, again, it's kind of the colonial thing, that this fruit has a special role in all of this colonial enterprise, and there's a lot that runs with that. It was a force for colonization everywhere, and it has an ancient history that way. So it shouldn't be any surprise that in North America, it's one of the very first things that's introduced. Does anybody else want to say anything about on that topic, the forbidden fruit?
Yeah. I lived in Yemen for a while, and they said that Eden was once in Yemen, of course, and they said that it was the quince. They had quinces. The quince, it looks like an apple. They have that there. I don't think they can grow apples. Their apples came from Spain, but they could grow quince.
Exactly, and then look, I mean, this was not a very fixed thing even in English Western culture. If you look at Blake's illustration in Paradise Lost, those are more quince-like than apple-like. Anyhow, I'd urge you to take a look at that article because it goes deep into the history. And again, you can see even in these Renaissance paintings, it's all kinds of different fruit. So it keeps moving around in culture. There is a question in the back. Yeah.
I just think this is a phenomenal class. I really, really applaud you. You're halfway through it, right? So my question is, you're identifying some possible places to go in Texas in search of your Texas beauty, and what opportunities do you have on a university semester system to continue your research?
Well, personally, I don't know about continuing it through the university, but through this class, I don't like apples. I'll say it, they're not my favorite fruit, which is really whack that I'm in this class, but I will say I will eat a green apple any day of the year because I like sour things. And so literally the first day, Dr. Gibbs' hands saw a packet, and I was like, oh boy, what did I get myself into? And then the very last section of this packet was a nursery catalog from my hometown, which is Stephenville, Texas, which is not anywhere near here in most geography ways. But I was looking at it and I was like, hey, I know, I've read about this place before. And so I was able to connect that to a book that my favorite history professor in high school gave, that he had written. And he was a really great man, and he had passed away recently. And so it was kind of it was really cool to see that connection. And I think this all ties back to how people being together and talking and writing things down really helps create a community that can be based around food. And through like all this other stuff, literally, this was a span of an hour in my dorm room, a week into school, far away from home, and I was like using this as my coping mechanism for homesickness. And so I was sitting there and I was reading, I was texting my mom, I was like, Mom, can you put a thing on Facebook? Because she's like really good about Facebook. And so I was like, hey, can you ask if anyone knows about this apple or anything like that? And like within seconds, like people from my hometown that I hadn't actually had a conversation with in forever were texting me and being like, hey, if you look at the Tarleton Library in like this section here, there's gonna be this catalog. And so even though I don't know if I would continue it through my university, I definitely think I would want to continue looking for these after this semester, just on my own, like just going around my little small town of Stephenville, Texas, and getting to know those people that like, they know who I am through my grandparents, but I'm not 100% sure who they are, and just getting to talk to them and being like, hey, you got a cool treat out there in your pasture, friend. Can I go see what's on there? Just because, like, I don't like apples, but I think these apples that that I haven't tried yet, they might actually taste pretty dang good. So, really, for me, I like the idea of having an excuse to go bother the old people of my town. I think that that's something that I'm really looking forward to doing. So, I don't know about university continuing through university, but definitely want to continue it on my own. I think I owe that to this class. So.
Yeah, we are, of course, the shop-worn expression, but we are looking for the low-hanging fruit that we might go after one or two, but it is a challenge. The time is going to run pretty quickly. And so building on what Courtney said, early on, so I handed out the packet, but I also handed out a bag of apples from my tree and said, make cider. Which is, people realized in many cases we got these great homespun cider recipes. I suppose I should add non-alcoholic, before a dean comes crashing through the door and says, no, no, no. The thing that brings out, I think, is that you have to get the human stories to get closer to the fruit. So if we can keep collecting those in various ways, if we keep developing this database, we're more and more likely to turn something up. And I don't know, Matt, did you want to say something?
I just wanted to add something that I don't think Dr. Gamblin mentioned. We weren't allowed to look up how to make cider.
No internet.
That wasn't allowed. So we just had to kind of figure it out, talk to our parents, and that was all we got. So there was no Googling or anything involved.
and recipes did come up. I was impressed that no one used like heavy machinery or trucks, and a little bit relieved. I was expecting apples to go out windows and everything, but people found very inventive ways with very few tools in dorms to make cider. So anyhow, that's all an aside. But I saw other hands up. There were some other questions. Yeah.
Well, before the question, you mentioned being interested in connecting to farmers markets in your area. Mm-hmm. I don't know any farmers markets here, but I could throw a name. She writes for Texas Monthly. Is a woman named Megan Kimball, who was one of the founding editors of Edible Baja Arizona under Barry Paul Beck and sort of oversight. She relocated to Texas. Her book on process is sort of all about living without eating processed foods. So that might be a topic of interest to her if you watch it out.
Fantastic.
Megan Kimball, she's very, very connected to the worlds you're so interested in. And then I have like a very technical question that maybe the class or you could answer. If you have this unknown variety of apple, is identifying it a scientific process, historical research, or like wine tasting? Like how do you figure out when you have this apple that you don't know what variety it is, how do you figure out what it is?
So I have an answer for that. So we have, in one of the books that got passed around, it has these identifying features for specific apples, as in like the bottom,
the shape,
the stem length, the leaves of the tree, the way the tree is shaped. There's a lot of different factors in identifying apples and the combination of such, along with the color, ripening time. It's a bit of both scientific, identifying the apple in your hand, and historical, looking on the paper to see, okay, what did it list it had, what can I cross-reference this with, and then kind of somewhat trial and error a little bit.
We're going to wrap up here, but you put your finger on something that's challenging too, and it's chain of provenance. You know, apples look a lot alike, and now Washington State is doing more genetic testing. Anyhow, thank you so much for your time and presentation this morning, and again, I want to congratulate the students for the great work. And I'll just add one last thing. We are going to have a PR push. We're trying to develop a website, but there are different ways to reach different communities. So if you want to put the word or put feelers out and help us out, we would love to have your support in finding the lost apples of Texas as well. Thanks.